The story begins late at night in an orphanage in London. The matron comes to the front door to close it, but she gets distracted by a magazine that has been slipped under the door along with the mail. She picks up the magazine and leaves without caring about the door, which frustrates the little girl hiding under a blanket on the stairs. This is Sophie, our 10-year-old protagonist. Wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, she goes to the door and locks it by herself before moving to the nearby pendulum clock and pushing the hand to mark 3 in the morning. As she picks up the mail and turns off the lights, she tells us that, unlike other people who choose midnight or 1 in the morning, Sophie thinks that 3 in the morning is the witching hour, the moment when only she is awake. She goes to the matron's table and places the mail in the corresponding tray, only to be distracted by some noises coming from outside. She goes to the window, opens it, and looks outside to discover 4 drunken men causing a ruckus. Sophie reprimands them, reminding them that there are children sleeping, and threatens to call the police if they don't stop. After switching off the streetlight and closing the window, the men decide not to risk it and leave. A strange moving shadow is seen in the window as Sophie leaves it to return to the room she shares with other orphans. Once back in bed, she covers herself with her blanket, puts on her glasses, and turns on a flashlight to continue reading her book. When the matron comes by to check on the children, she turns off the light and hides under the covers, only to turn it back on as soon as the matron leaves. Not much reading is accomplished after that, because Sophie soon hears a noise outside and decides to investigate. She slowly approaches the windows while repeating the rules. Never get out of bed, never go to the window, and never look behind the curtain. She breaks all 3 and goes to the balcony, where she sees that it was a bunch of cats making the noise, or so she thinks. Suddenly, a giant hand appears around a house and grabs the trash can that the cats knocked over. The hand is quickly followed by a large face and a huge body belonging to a giant man who is shocked to discover he has been seen by Sophie. She runs back to her bed to hide under the blanket when she sees him running towards her, but that is not enough to stop the giant. He simply sticks his hand through the window and grabs her, blanket and book included. The giant begins running through London. Her blanket is folded into something like a sack so that she can be carried, and from her place there, Sophie can see how the giant performs different tricks that go unnoticed in the city, like pretending to be a wall, covering streetlights, pretending to be cargo in a truck, or even a tree. As they manage to leave London, the giant continues to escape, taking large leaps across the countryside and then over the sea until they reach a thick accumulation of clouds. The giant easily goes through this before running into a new area full of random human objects and rock formations. He doesn't stop until they enter a furnished cave. This is his home. He hangs the blanket with Sophie on a tree branch and goes to his table to cut a strangely looking vegetable. Sophie seizes the opportunity to escape, climbing out of the blanket and going to the tree where she was left. Following its branches, she reaches the window, which she manages to open after pushing very hard. However, she ends up pushing some objects to the ground as well, calling the giant's attention. He approaches and tells her that there is nowhere to go if she doesn't have wings. Then he pushes the window, which in turn pushes Sophie into the frying pan he is holding. He returns to the table and, after leaving the frying pan on it, continues cutting the vegetable. Sophie asks him where they are, and he replies that it's the land of giants, to which Sophie observes that there is no such thing. Suddenly, a noise from outside scares her. The giant looks out the window and confirms that they are the other giants, all of whom have names like Man-Eaters and Jungle Destroyer. Scared, Sophie pleads with him not to eat her, but the giant laughs at the idea of eating humans, his way of speaking accompanied by grammatical errors and strange words. When Sophie reminds him that he kidnapped her, he concedes that this is true, and that he can't help but think about her parents, but she points out that she is an orphan and hated living in the orphanage, where there were too many rules and punishments. The giant insults the matron for that while returning Sophia her glasses, and she asks him if the other giants are nice too. He answers while filling his bowl with a stew of strange vegetables. He replies that the other giants do indeed eat humans and also consider the kind giant a little person. Sophie doesn't understand why she was brought here. Then, the giant explains that he did this because he can't let her tell everyone about giants. That would make the humans come and imprison them like animals. No matter how much Sophie swears she won't tell and asks to be taken back, the giant refuses and says she will stay there for the rest of her life. After finishing his stew, which he doesn't like, the giant covers Sophie with his blanket to silence her, but she tells him she's going to run away anyway. The giant catches her and reprimands her for that, reminding her that running away would mean being caught by the man-eating giants. So, he takes her to his ship bed and puts her inside the crow's nest, where she gets annoyed and corrects the words he is saying wrong. The giant feels hurt by that, saying he can't help how he speaks, so Sophie apologizes. She watches him take his backpack and pull out a glowing jar. He explains that there are dreams inside. When she mentions that she doesn't dream because she has insomnia, he takes her book and starts reading it to her, making her fall asleep. Now she can no longer see him. The giant takes his backpack and goes to the back of the cave, where he pulls a lever that opens a hidden door behind a waterfall. Behind the door is his lab, filled with thousands of jars containing dreams. The giant sits at his table and starts mixing dream ingredients to make a nightmare for Sophie. A few hours later, Sophie wakes up and sees the giant sleeping in the ship bed. She decides to take advantage of this chance to escape. She pushes the swaying mast of the ship through the window and jumps out, managing to get away. She doesn't get very far. Suddenly, one giant wakes up and grabs her. The kind giant sees this but ignores her pleas for help, so Sophie is eaten by the mean giant. This turns out to be the nightmare the giant made for her, Sophie discovers upon waking up for real in the morning. As he takes her from the bed to the table, the giant explains that he did what he needed to do to keep her safe. He sits down to have breakfast, and Sophie notices a bottle with a liquid that fizzes downwards instead of upward. The giant tells her that it's fragmented, the only thing giants drink, and takes a sip, which makes him release gas bubbles. They are suddenly interrupted by the leader of the man-eating giants, Flesh Lump Eater, who wants the kind giant to cure his injury. As Sophie hides behind objects on the table, the kind giant tells her they can do that later, but Flesh Lump Eater insists it happens now. The kind giant grabs a bucket of water, which frightens Flesh Lump Eater, and a cloth that he uses to start tending to the injury. While he is busy with this, Flesh Lump Eater sniffs the air and asks the giant if he has acquired a new human because he can smell one. The giant denies it, while Sophie is hiding inside the strange vegetable, a snozzcumber. But Flesh Lump Eater says he is hungry and continues searching. He finds the snozzcumber, and the giant encourages him to eat it as a distraction. Flesh Lump Eater is about to bite it when the giant realizes that Sophie is hiding inside, so he stops him by reminding that he hates vegetables. This makes Flesh Lump Eater drop the snozzcumber. Then he grabs the bottle of frobscottle instead and leaves after telling the kind giant that he is an insult to giant kind. The giant places the snozzcumber back on the table, allowing Sophie to come out all dirty. He offers his hand for her to climb, which she does after some hesitation. She is taken to the dream lab, where the giant has a water tank that he opens for her to wash. Afterward, she is placed in front of the boiler, which she finds too hot. After placing her on the table, the giant gives her a box with human clothes, so she changes under a sheet while the giant puts her things in a hole in the tree for her to sleep. When he turns around, Sophie is wearing a dress and a jacket that make her look gloomy. He picks her up and takes her to the tree hole because he needs to go out to work. When Sophie asks what his job is, the giant says it's a secret, but admits that it's about catching dreams. He says he can't reveal more than that. Sophie wants to go with him, but the giant refuses. She tries to ask again after turning her jacket inside out and stepping out of the tree, begging and repeatedly pleading until the giant gives in and agrees. With Sophie mounted on his shoulder, the giant exits the cave and shows her how the other giants sleep in the field during the day. He moves carefully and quietly around them to pass by the cliff, but Flesh Lump Eater suddenly wakes up and grabs him by the leg. Sophie falls and runs to hide in a nearby car, leaving her blanket behind while the mean giants toss the kind giant around like a football. Then they come up with an idea for a game. The giant who has Sophie's friend gets a car and takes them to one side of the hill, while another giant gets 2 more cars, including the one with Sophie, and takes them to the other side. The kind friend is placed on top of the car and pushed downhill, while at the same time, the other giant comes down the other side on top of both cars. Seeing that the collision is imminent, Sophie grabs the steering wheel and forces herself to turn the car, making the giant open his legs and hit his groin against the kind friend. The giants find all of this very funny, and they are ready to bully more when it suddenly starts to rain. As they all fear the water, they run to find shelter while the kind giant grabs Sophie and her glasses and escapes. Meanwhile, the mean giants find Sophie's blanket and smell it. They are sure that a human is nearby now. After a long walk, the giant crosses another thick accumulation of clouds, and they arrive at the land of dreams, where it is already night. The giant tells Sophie that he can hear what the stars, animals, and trees say to one another before placing her on the ground. She walks towards a lake that reflects a giant tree with lights that do not appear on the real tree. The giant then admits that he used to be called the Big Friendly Giant before jumping into the lake. Sophie follows him and lands on the reflected ground, which is the place where the giant catches all the dreams that spill from the tree's leaves. There is one particularly energetic dream that the giant struggles to catch, so Sophie guides him through it. He manages to catch it when he gets close to the girl, and after placing it in a jar, the dream draws Sophie's face. The giant encourages Sophie to chase some dreams, which she does after a moment of hesitation. After chasing after some different lights, she captures a red one, which makes the giant quickly snatch it from her hands and lock it in a jar for being a nightmare. He explains that this type of dream is dangerous and tells her never to touch one again. The giant suddenly disappears, and Sophie calls for him, worried. But it turns out he just left the lake, and now he is pulling her out too. As they make their way back, Sophie decides to shorten his name and start calling him BFG. A few hours later, they arrive in London, where BFG uses his dream trumpet to spread dreams among sleeping children. While he works, he tells Sophie that he is as old as the earth itself and that he can hear the hearts of children, including hers. After watching a child dreaming about the American president, they leave London. But suddenly they have to stop and hide when they hear the man-eating giants returning from the city too. They had been abducting and eating humans. After they leave, BFG asks Sophie about her blanket, and she says she left it in the land of giants, which worries BFG. Suddenly, we cut to a sleeping Sophie, who wakes up in front of the orphanage. She thinks she is dreaming, but she isn't. BFG appears at the end of the street and explains that the other giants will know about her because she dropped her blanket, so he must leave her there. Sophie doesn't accept this, so BFG tells her about a boy who used to live with him and whom he couldn't save from the hunger of the giants. This doesn't scare Sophie, but BFG leaves anyway. Sophie returns to her bed in the orphanage and remembers that BFG told her he could hear everything, so she goes to the balcony and jumps, knowing he is still nearby. She is right. BFG catches her before she hits the ground and decides to take her with him. Flesh Lumpeter sees them as they return to the land of giants. Once inside the dream lab, they try to think of a plan when suddenly the mean giants invade and start destroying everything while hunting for Sophie, who is hiding in her tree hole. The giants' noses lead them to her hideout, so she must leave the tree and sneak through the lab to escape them. After a frustrated attempt to get into BFG's backpack, she enters a different tree hole, where she finds the previous boy's room filled with furniture and drawings. Flesh Lumpeter is about to find her there, so BFG finally gathers the courage and begins to chase the giants away, first hitting them with a hot iron and then threatening them with a bucket of water. Meanwhile, Sophie finds a portrait of the queen in the tree hole, and this gives her an idea. She comes out and, after telling BFG that she thinks he speaks beautifully, tells him she has a plan. They will ask for help from the queen. For this, they will need a very special nightmare, so they move to BFG's table to prepare it. They mix the sparklers of humans and the man-eating giants and destroy the army. With Sophie and BFG having made the nightmare, they put it in a jar. The plan is to make the queen dream about this to scare her, and she will wake up to see Sophie and BFG at her window. BFG refuses to be seen by more people. Then we cut to Buckingham Palace, where we see Sophie has managed to convince BFG to come anyway. After sneaking past the soldiers, they arrive at the queen's window, where BFG blows the nightmare into the queen's mind. When morning comes, the queen wakes up quite distressed and talks about her horrible dream to her team, Mary and Mr. Tibbs, who have come to bring her breakfast. As the queen describes the man-eating giants, Mary opens the newspaper and sees that children have disappeared, which corresponds to the queen's dream. Becoming suspicious, the queen asks Mary to close the curtains, which allows them to find Sophie standing on the window ledge. She mentions that her giant friend brought her there, which causes Mr. Tibbs to call the soldiers to the garden. The queen realizes that everything she saw in her dream is true and asks Sophie to introduce them to her friend. Sophie calls BFG after the Queen promises that she won't hurt him, but he is scared, so he doesn't come out until Sophie asks him to be brave. The soldiers surround him when he enters the garden, but the Queen keeps her word and has Mr. Tibbs tell the soldiers to stay back. BFG approaches the window and bows to the Queen, telling her they have come to bring assistance. The Queen accepts, but first, she needs to change. Moments later, while the Queen calls her ministers and army leaders, Sophie receives better clothes and a makeover before they go out for breakfast. BFG crawls into the palace and joins them in the dining room, where a giant special table has been set up for him. A colossal amount of food is brought to them, and when BFG tastes it for the first time, he delights in the flavor and decides he will never eat snozcumbers again. However, he doesn't like the coffee and spits it all over some butlers. He thinks a better drink is needed, so he pulls out a bottle of frobscottle from his backpack and presents it to the Queen. The army leaders then arrive, and the Queen orders them to defeat the mean giants in the land of giants, which they will reach by following BFG's guidance. After pointing out that his country is off the map, BFG serves frobscottle for everyone, even for the leaders. Everyone toasts to his name and takes a sip, which makes them release gas. The Queen declares that it is time to execute the plan. BFG runs back to the land of giants. The army follows him in their planes. When they reach the thick clouds, the plane's radars and controls go crazy, but they manage to pass through safely anyway. The army decides to hold back and wait for the right moment while BFG and Sophie return to the Dream Lab. There, they make a new nightmare for the giants using the one she caught in the lake. This will cause terrible despair. After the mixture is made, they take the jar outside, and BFG tells Sophie that his own dream is to have a family, which she cannot achieve if she stays there. BFG asks her not to worry because he will always be there for her and will be able to hear her with his extraordinarily large ears. When the sun rises, it is time to spread the nightmare to the giants, but BFG realizes he forgot his trumpet at the palace, so Sophie takes the jar and heads to the giants by herself. She walks to the middle of the sleeping giants, but fails to open the jar. Flesh Lumpeter then wakes up and sees her, so Sophie improvises and breaks the jar to release the nightmare, which quickly invades the giants' minds. Flesh Lumpeter grabs his and smashes it, but the other giants are affected by it, so they begin to run as guilt consumes them. Flesh Lumpeter, getting irritated, tries to grab Sophie, but BFG leaps in to defend her. Flesh Lumpeter grabs him and is about to punch him when his arm is suddenly held by a wire. The planes have finally arrived. Sophie runs across the field to avoid being hit while the army descends upon them, capturing all the giants with wires and nets. BFG comes to grab her and keep her safe, and together they watch the planes fly away, taking the giants with them. They are taken to a secluded island from which they cannot escape, and the only food left to them is the disgusting snozcumber and its seeds. Meanwhile, Sophie returns to London, where she moves into Buckingham Palace to live with Mary, Mr. Tibbs, and the Queen's corgis. The movie ends with Sophie waking up one morning and telling us about the dream she had of BFG living happily in his land, with new, better-tasting vegetables to grow in his garden. She approaches the window and, as she always does when she feels lonely, whispers words to the wind, knowing that they will reach BFG. Back in the land of giants, BFG smiles when those words reach his ears.